I still remember the smell of fresh sawdust and my grandfather's calloused hands, guiding mine as we hammered nails into the wooden frame. I was 7 years old, standing on a makeshift stool in what would become the living room of our family. Home in suburban Michigan. Grandpa Joe wiped sweat from his forehead with his worn flannel sleeve and smiled down at me. "This house is going to be yours someday, kiddo," he said, his voice carrying that gravelly warmth that only comes from decades of hard work and harder love. "Your grandma and I, we're building this for generations. This isn't just wood and nails, this is legacy." Those words echoed in my mind for the next 23 years. Through scraped knees on the front porch steps, through teenage heartbreaks in my bedroom under the slanted roof, through college graduation parties in the backyard where Grandpa had planted an oak tree the year I was born. Every milestone of my life happened within those walls that my grandparents had built with their own hands during the summer of 1987. The house on Maple Street wasn't mansion-sized, but it was perfect. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with windows that caught the morning sun just right, and a basement where my dad had set up his workshop, the same one where Grandpa Joe had taught him woodworking, and where Dad had taught me. 4 generations of our family had learned to use a saw in that basement. 4 generations had celebrated Christmas mornings around the fireplace my grandfather had laid brick by brick. My parents, Michael and Sarah, had moved in right after their wedding in 1992. I came along 2 years later, and my sister Emma followed 3 years after that. We were the American dream personified, a middle-class family in a house built on love, sweat, and the unshakable belief that hard work would always be rewarded. Dad worked as a project manager for a construction company, and Mom taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. More importantly, we were happy. Our dinner table conversations were filled with laughter, homework help, and Dad's stories about the houses he was helping to build across the state. He'd always end these stories the same way, but none of them will ever be as special as ours, because ours was built with love. Emma and I grew up knowing that we were lucky. While our friends moved from rental to rental or watched their parents struggle with mortgage, we had stability. We had roots. We had a place that would always be ours, no matter what life threw at us. When I turned 18 and headed off to State University for my business degree, Dad pulled me aside on the front porch, the same porch where Grandpa Joe had taught me to whittle, where I'd shared my first kiss with Jennifer Morrison when I was 16, where our family had watched 4th of July fireworks every year of my life. "Son," Dad said, his hand heavy on my shoulder, "you're going out into the world now, and that's exactly what you should do. But remember, this house will always be here for you. When you're ready to settle down, when you want to start your own family, this place will be yours. It's your inheritance, your birthright. Your grandparents built it for you, just as much as they built it for your mom and me." I hugged him tight that night, breathing in the familiar scent of his aftershave mixed with sawdust that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. "Thanks, Dad. I promise I'll make you proud." "You already have?" he whispered back. "College flew by in a blur of business classes, internships, and the gradual understanding that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I'd inherited more than just the promise of a house. I'd inherited the family work ethic. The belief that anything was possible if you were willing to roll up your sleeves and do whatever it took. While my classmates partied, I worked 2 jobs and invested every spare dollar I could in the stock market. While they slept in, I was reading business books and dreaming of the company I wanted to start. I graduated summa cum laude in 2016 and moved back home to save money while I launched my first business, a digital marketing consultancy that I ran out of Dad's basement workshop. Mom would bring me sandwiches and coffee while I worked late into the night, building client relationships and slowly growing my revenue. Dad would peek over my shoulder at my spreadsheets and shake his head in amazement. "I don't understand half of what you're doing on that computer," he'd say with pride in his voice. "But I can see you're building something important." Just like Grandpa Joe built this house one piece at a time, with patience and determination. The business grew faster than I'd expected. Within 2 years, I had 15 employees and had moved into a proper office space downtown. I was making Good money better than good money, but I was working 16-hour days and hadn't taken a real vacation since college. Mom worried I was burning myself out, but I was driven by a vision that went beyond just financial success. I wanted to make enough money to expand the house, to add on a master suite where I could live while also having space for my parents as they aged. I dreamed of raising my own children in those same rooms where I'd grown up, of teaching them woodworking in Grandpa's basement, of continuing the legacy that had been started with hand tools and determination 4 decades earlier. Emma had different plans. She'd married her college boyfriend, David, and moved to California to pursue her dream of becoming a marine biologist. She loved the house, loved our family, but she'd never felt the same calling to stay that I had. During one of our phone calls, she made it clear that she supported my vision. "You've always been the one who belonged there," she said. "Even when we were kids, you were the one who helped Dad with repairs, who listened to Grandpa's stories about building it. When the time comes, you should have it. I'll make my own way out here." That conversation filled me with even more determination. I wasn't just working for myself, I was working to preserve something precious, something irreplaceable. Every client I signed, every late night I spent perfecting a marketing campaign, every dollar I saved and invested was bringing me closer to the future I could see so clearly. By the time I turned 28, my consultancy had grown into a full-service digital agency with 35 employees and clients across the Midwest. I'd bought my own condo downtown, but I still spent most Sundays at the family house, helping Dad with yard work and having dinner with my parents. Those Sundays were sacred to me. They kept me grounded, reminded me what I was working toward. It was during one of those Sunday dinners that I first noticed something was different. Dad seemed distracted, more quiet than usual. When I asked him about a project at work, he gave short, vague answers. Mom kept glancing at him with a worried expression, and the easy conversation that usually flowed around our dinner table felt stilted and uncomfortable. "Everything okay, Dad?" I asked as I helped him carry dishes to the kitchen after dinner. "You seem like something's bothering you." He paused at the sink, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. For a moment, I thought he was going to open up, to share whatever was weighing on him. Instead, he turned on the water and began washing dishes with more force than necessary. "Just work stuff," he said without looking at me. "Nothing you need to worry about." But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched. This wasn't just work stuff. This was something bigger, something that was eating at him in a way I'd never seen before. I should have pressed harder. I should have insisted on knowing what was wrong. Instead, I respected his privacy and went home that night with a nagging feeling that something fundamental was about to change in our family. I told myself I was being paranoid, that every family goes through rough patches, that whatever was bothering Dad would work itself out. 3 weeks later, I learned just how wrong I was. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in a client meeting. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Can you come to the house tonight? We need to talk." The formal tone of the message sent ice through my veins. Dad never texted like that. Our communication was usually casual, warm, filled with inside jokes and references to shared memories. This sounded like a business meeting, not a conversation between father and son. I wrapped up my meeting as quickly as possible and drove to Maple Street with my stomach churning. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed that Emma's old bedroom light was on strange. Since she was 3,000 miles away in San Diego, Mom's car was in the garage. But the house felt different somehow, colder, less welcoming than it had ever felt in my entire life. I knocked on the front door, which was bizarre in itself. I'd never knocked on that door. This was my home, my family, my future. But something about Dad's text had made me feel like I needed permission to enter, like I was no longer the son who belonged there automatically. Dad opened the door with an expression I'd never seen before. Not angry exactly, but distant, guarded. He looked like he was steeling himself for an unpleasant task. The way people look when they're about to deliver bad news to a friend or fire an employee they actually like. "Come in," he said simply, stepping aside. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of her. Legal documents, from what I could see. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying, and she couldn't quite meet my gaze when I walked into the room. "Sit down, son," Dad said, pulling out the chair across from Mom. I remained standing. Every instinct I had was screaming that I didn't want to hear whatever they were about to tell me. If I didn't sit down, if I kept standing, maybe I could somehow prevent the conversation from happening. Maybe I could keep living in the world where I knew exactly what my future looked like. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. Dad sat down heavily and picked up one of the legal documents. "I've been doing some estate planning," he said, still not quite looking at me. "Getting our affairs in order, making sure everything is properly documented." Estate planning, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Are you sick? Is that what this is about?" "If you're sick, we can—" "I'm not sick," Dad interrupted. "This is just responsible adult stuff. Things I should have taken care of years ago." He paused, and in that silence I felt the entire trajectory of my life beginning to shift. The ground beneath my feet, the foundation that had supported every decision I'd made for the past decade, was starting to crack. "The house," he continued, his voice steady but somehow empty of all the warmth I'd known my entire life, "is going to Emma." The words didn't make sense at first. They bounced around in my head like a foreign language I was trying to translate. Emma lived in California. Emma had never wanted the house. Emma had explicitly told me I should have it. "I don't understand," I said, finally sinking into the chair because my legs suddenly felt too weak to support me. "Emma is the oldest," Dad said, as if that explained everything, "and David has a stable job. They'll need a place to raise their family when they decide to have kids." "But Emma doesn't want the house," I protested, my voice rising. "She told me herself that she thought I should have it. She's building a life in California. She loves it there." "Plans change," Mom said quietly, speaking for the first time since I'd arrived. "People change." I stared at her, searching her face for some sign that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding that we could clear up with a simple conversation. Instead, I saw something that looked almost like guilt, mixed with a resignation that made my chest tight with panic. "What about everything Grandpa Joe said?" I asked, turning back to Dad. "What about the legacy? What about the conversations we've had for my entire life about me taking over the house someday?" Dad's jaw tightened. "Your grandfather said a lot of things, but the reality is that I own this house now, and I have to make the decision that's best for the family. I am family." The words exploded out of me before I could stop them. "I'm your son. I've spent my entire adult life building a business, saving money, planning for the future based on the promise that this house would be mine. How is cutting me out of that what's best for the family?" "You're doing fine on your own," Dad said, and there was something in his tone that I'd never heard before, something almost cold. "You have your business, your condo, your investments. You don't need this house. It's not about need." I stood up so fast that my chair scraped against the floor. "It's about family. It's about the promise you made to me. It's about 30 years of believing that this was my home, my future, my inheritance." "Well, maybe it's time you stopped depending on inheritance and started making your own way in the world," Dad said, and the words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. I stared at him, this man who had raised me, who had taught me everything I knew about work ethic and integrity and keeping your word. He was looking at me like I was a stranger, like I was some entitled kid who had never worked for anything in his life. "I have made my own way," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and rage. "I built a successful business from nothing. I employ 35 people. I've never asked you for money, never expected anything from you except for you to keep the promise you've been making to me since I was 7 years old." "Promises change," he said simply. "Life is complicated. You'll understand when you're older. When I'm older." I was 30 years old, a successful entrepreneur, a grown man who had spent a decade building a life based on the foundation he had provided. And he was talking to me like I was a child who couldn't understand adult decisions. Does Emma even know about this? I asked. Mom and Dad exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know. Emma didn't know. They'd made this decision without consulting her, probably assuming she'd go along with whatever they decided. They'd certainly made it without consulting me, despite the fact that it would fundamentally alter the course of my life. "We'll discuss it with Emma," Mom said. "When?" I demanded. "After you've already filed the paperwork? After it's too late for any of us to have a say in what happens to the house our grandparents built." "This conversation is over," Dad said, standing up and gathering the legal documents. "I've made my decision. As the homeowner, as the head of this family, it's my right to decide what happens to my property." His property, not our family home. Not the house his parents had built for future generations. His property? I looked around the kitchen, seeing it as if for the first time. The scratches on the table from when Emma and I had done homework there every night for years. The height marks on the doorframe where Dad had measured us every birthday. The window above the sink where Mom had grown herbs, where she'd stood, washing dishes while humming and watching us play in the backyard. All of it was apparently meaningless. All of it was just property to be distributed according to Dad's will, regardless of what it meant to the people who had grown up believing it would always be their home. "I need to go," I said, heading toward the door. "Son," Dad started, but I cut him off.
"Don't," I said without turning around. "Just don't."
I walked out of the house where I'd learned to walk, where I'd celebrated every birthday and Christmas and milestone of my life, where I'd fallen asleep. Every night for 8 years, believing I was safe and loved and part of something permanent. The front door closed behind me with a finality that echoed through my chest like a gunshot dot as I sat in my car in the driveway, staring at the house that was no longer my future. I made a promise to myself. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but somehow, someday, I was going to make sure that the house my grandparents built with their own hands didn't slip away from our family forever. I was going to find a way to bring it home. The days following that conversation blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and furious productivity. I threw myself into work with an intensity that worried my employees and probably should have worried me. But I needed the distraction. Every time I stopped moving, stopped thinking about client strategies and revenue projections, my mind went straight back to that kitchen table, and the look on my father's face as he casually destroyed the future I'd spent 30 years building. I didn't call Emma right away. Part of me hoped she'd call me first, that Mom and Dad would tell her about their decision, and she'd immediately call to say there had been some kind of mistake. When 3 weeks passed without hearing from her, I realized I was going to have to make the call myself. I waited until a Friday evening, calculating the time difference so I'd catch her after work, but before she went out for the night. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that made my chest ache. "Hey, little brother. What's up? How are Mom and Dad?" The casual warmth in her voice made what I had to tell her even harder. We need to talk. Have Mom and Dad called you recently?" "Not for a couple weeks." "Why? Is everything okay?" I took a deep breath and told her everything. The surprise meeting, the legal documents, the cold way Dad had delivered the news that she was inheriting the house while I got nothing. I explained how he'd spoken to me like I was some entitled stranger, how 30 years of promises had been dismissed as if they'd never mattered at all. Emma was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with anger I rarely heard from her. "They didn't ask me," she said. "They didn't even call to tell me. They just decided, like I'm some chess piece they can move around the board without consulting." "So you didn't know?" "Of course I didn't know. And if I had known, I would have told them they were being ridiculous. You're the one who should inherit the house. You're the one who stayed, who built a life there, who actually wants it. I love that house, but it's not my home anymore. California is my home now." The relief that flooded through me was so strong it made me dizzy. For 3 weeks, I'd been wondering if my own sister had somehow turned against me, if there was some family conspiracy I wasn't aware of. Hearing the indignation in her voice, the immediate loyalty reminded me that I wasn't crazy. The way our parents had handled this was wrong, and Emma could see it just as clearly as I could. "I'm going to call them," she continued. "This is insane. They can't just make major family decisions without talking to the people those decisions affect." Wait, I said quickly. "Before you call them, I need to tell you something else." I'm not going to fight this through family channels. I'm not going to spend the next however many years trying to convince Dad to change his mind or arguing about it at family dinners. What do you mean? I'd been thinking about this for weeks, running numbers and exploring possibilities in the back of my mind while I tried to make sense of what had happened. Now, speaking it out loud to Emma, the plan crystallized into something concrete and achievable. I'm going to buy the house myself. Emma was quiet for a moment. Can you do that? I mean, financially? I think so. My business is doing well, better than I've let on to Mom and Dad. I've been conservative with my spending and aggressive with my investments. If I liquidate some assets, take out a business loan for the rest, I could probably make an offer that would be hard to refuse. But would they sell it to you? If Dad is determined to leave it to me instead of you, would he really turn around and sell it to you now? That was the question I'd been wrestling with. I knew my father well enough to know that his pride wouldn't let him simply reverse his decision, especially not after the way our last conversation had ended. But I also knew that he was practical above all else. If I could make an offer that was significantly above market value, an offer that would set my parents up financially for the rest of their lives, I think he would, I said slowly. Especially if the offer came at the right time, in the right way. He's always been motivated by what he thinks is best for the family financially. If I can make him see that selling to me would be better for everyone than leaving it to you, I'm going to help you, Emma said suddenly. What do you mean? I mean, I'm going to call them and make it clear that I don't want the house. I'm going to tell them that giving it to me when you're the one who actually wants it is not just unfair. To you, it's unfair to me too. I don't want to be responsible for maintaining a property 3,000 miles away. I don't want to have to figure out what to do with a house I can't live in. The solidarity in her voice made my throat tight with gratitude. Are you sure? I don't want to put you in the middle of this. I'm already in the middle of it, she said firmly. They put me in the middle when they made this decision without talking to any of us. And honestly, I'm pissed off on your behalf. What they did was cruel. That word cruel hit me harder than I expected. In all my anger and hurt, I'd been trying to convince myself that my parents had made a mistake, that they'd somehow miscalculated, or misunderstood something, but Emma was right. What they'd done was cruel. There was no other way to describe the casual dismissal of 30 years of promises, the cold way they'd delivered news that would fundamentally change my life. Thank you, I said. I can't tell you how much it means to me that you're on my side. I'm always on your side, she said. That's what family does. Real family anyway. After we hung up, I felt energized for the first time since that awful night in my parents' kitchen. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't just a victim of their arbitrary decision. I had options, and I had an ally over the next several weeks. I threw myself into planning with the same intensity I'd brought to building my business. I researched property values in the neighborhood, looked into financing options, and ran financial projections until I could recite them in my sleep. The numbers were tight, but they worked. If I sold my condo, liquidated most of my investment portfolio, and took out a substantial business loan, I could make an offer of $420,000 for a house that was probably worth $340,000 on the open market. It would essentially wipe out my savings and put me in debt for the first time since college. But it would also give me something that couldn't be bought at any price, the home where I belonged. Emma called our parents 2 days after our conversation. She told me later that Dad had been surprised by her reaction that he'd clearly expected her to be grateful and excited about inheriting the house. When she explained that she had no interest in owning property in Michigan and thought the decision was unfair to me, he'd gotten defensive. He kept saying that he was doing what was best for the family, Emma told me during our follow-up call. When I pointed out that you are family too, and that what's best for you should matter just as much as what's best for me, he got that stubborn tone he gets when he knows he's wrong but doesn't want to admit it. What about Mom? She was quiet. Mostly, I think she feels bad about how they handled it, but she's not going to go against Dad on this. You know how she is, she picks her battles, and apparently this isn't one she's willing to fight. That stung, but it didn't surprise me. Mom had always been the peacekeeper in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts rather than addressing. And head on? I'd hoped that maybe she'd speak up for me, but I understood why she hadn't. Did you tell them I was planning to make an offer? No, I thought you should do that yourself. But I did tell them that if they were determined to get rid of the house, they should consider what Grandpa Joe would have wanted. I reminded them that he built it for the family, for future generations, and that giving it to someone who can't even live in it doesn't honor his intentions. How did Dad react to that? Emma was quiet for a moment.
He said that Grandpa Joe was dead.
And that the living had to make practical decisions based on current reality, not sentimental memories. The words hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa Joe wasn't just dead, he was dismissed, irrelevant. His dreams and intentions reduced to sentimental memories that had no place in practical adult decision-making. That night, I sat in my condo, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the man who had taught me to hammer nails and whittle wood, who had told me stories about building our house board by board. I thought about his calloused hands and his proud smile when he talked about legacy and family and the importance of building something that would last. I made a decision that night that went beyond just buying the house. I was going to restore it to exactly the way Grandpa Joe had envisioned it. I was going to honor his memory and his intentions, even if his own son had forgotten what they meant. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney and started the process of putting together an official offer. I also called my financial advisor and my banker, setting in motion the complex process of liquidating assets and securing the loan. I'd need to make the purchase possible. It took 3 weeks to get all the paperwork in order. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and constant recalculations of second-guessing myself and then recommitting to the plan. 3 weeks of imagining my parents' reaction when they realized that their son, the one they'd dismissed as too dependent on inheritance, was prepared to pay cash for the house they tried to give away. On a Wednesday morning in early November, I drove to my parents' house with a cashier's check and a purchase agreement. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was once again knocking on the door of what should have been my own home, waiting for permission to enter. Dad answered the door with a confused expression. What are you doing here? I thought we'd said everything we needed to say. I have a business proposition for you, I said, holding up the manila envelope that contained the offer. He stared at the envelope for a long moment, then stepped aside to let me in. Mom was in the living room, and from the way she immediately looked nervous, I suspected she'd been watching from the window and had seen me coming. What kind of business proposition? Dad asked as we all sat down in the living room where I'd opened Christmas presents every year of my childhood. I pulled out the purchase agreement and set it on the coffee table between us. I'd like to make an offer to buy the house. Dad picked up the document and started reading. I watched his eyes widen as he got to the purchase price, then narrow as he continued through the terms. When he finished reading, he set the papers down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. $420,000, he said slowly. Cash, I added. No financing contingencies, no inspection period. I can close in 2 weeks. Mom leaned forward to look at the offer, her hand covering her mouth as she saw the numbers.
Honey, where did you get this kind of money?
I built a business, Mom. A successful one. More successful than I think either of you realized. Dad was still staring at the paperwork. This is $80,000 more than the house is worth. It's what the house is worth to me, I said simply. We sat in silence for several minutes. I could see Dad's mind working, calculating what $420,000 in cash would mean for their retirement, for their financial security. I could also see him struggling with the implications of accepting the offer, the admission that maybe he'd been wrong about my capabilities, wrong about what was best for the family. Why? He finally asked. Because it's my home, I said. Because Grandpa Joe built it for family, and I'm family. Because you raised me to believe that hard work and determination could get you anything you wanted. And I want this house more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. But if we sell it to you, Mom said quietly, then Emma doesn't inherit anything. Emma doesn't want to inherit anything, I replied. She told you that herself. What she wants is for this family to stop making decisions that hurt each other. Unnecessarily, Dad looked at the offer again, then at me. You'd really liquidate everything you've built just to buy this house? Not everything. But yes, I'd give up my financial security to secure my family legacy. Just like Grandpa Joe gave up his time and his energy to build something that would last for generations. I could see something shifting in Dad's expression. Some recognition of the parallel I'd drawn. He looked around the room, at the fireplace his father had built, at the built-in bookshelves his father had crafted, at the hardwood floors his father had installed by hand. I need to think about this, he said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. The offer is good for 30 days. I left the documents on their coffee table and drove home, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. I just committed to spending every dollar I had on a house that my parents might refuse to sell me out of pride or stubbornness or simple spite. But as I sat in my condo that night, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the oak tree in the backyard of the house on Maple Street, I knew I'd made the right choice. Win or lose, I'd fought for what mattered to me. I'd honored the legacy that Grandpa Joe had started and that I was determined to continue. The call came 3 days later. Dad's voice was formal, businesslike, but I could hear something underneath. That might have been respect. We accept your offer, he said. When can we schedule the closing? The closing was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 1 month after I'd made the offer. Those 30 days felt like the longest of my life, a strange liminal space where I wasn't quite the son who'd been cut from the inheritance, but wasn't yet the homeowner who'd fought his way back to where he belonged. I spent the time getting my affairs in order with an almost obsessive attention to detail. My condo sold faster than I'd expected to a young couple who loved the downtown location and modern amenities. Watching them walk through the rooms where I'd lived for the past 5 years, seeing their excitement about making it their own, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and relief. The condo had been a good home, but it had never been my true home. It had been a placeholder, a stepping stone toward the life I'd always known I was meant to live. Emma flew in from California the week before the closing. She claimed it was just her regular Christmas visit, but I knew she wanted to be there for moral support. The first night she was home, we met for dinner at Romano's, the Italian restaurant where our family had celebrated every birthday and graduation for as long as I could remember. How are you feeling about all this? She asked as we waited for our food to arrive. I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. Terrified, I admitted. I've never made a decision this big before. I've never risked everything on something that might not work out. What do you mean, might not work out? You're buying the house. That part is definitely going to work out. I mean, living there, I said. Being neighbors with Mom and Dad after everything that's happened. Trying to rebuild relationships that might be permanently damaged. What if I buy the house and then realize I can't actually be happy there because of all the bad feelings? Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You know what I think? I think you're overthinking this. You belong in that house. You've always belonged in that house. The fact that you're willing to pay twice what it's worth just to live there proves it. I'm not paying twice what it's worth, I protested. I'm paying what it's worth to me. Exactly, she said with a smile. And that's why this is going to work out. You're not buying a house, really. You're buying back your birthright. The night before the closing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Grandpa Joe, wondering what he would have thought about the way things had unfolded. Would he have been proud that I'd fought to keep the house he built in the family? Or would he have been disappointed that it had come to this, that his son and grandson had to conduct their relationship through real estate transactions instead of love and trust? At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and drove to Maple Street. I parked across from the house and sat in my car, looking at the structure that had shaped my entire life. The porch light was on, casting the same warm glow I remembered. From 1,000 nights coming home late from dates or jobs or friends' houses. The oak tree Grandpa had planted was bare now, its branches reaching toward the December sky like arms stretched in prayer. In less than 12 hours. I would own this house. I would have the keys, the deed, the legal right to call it mine. But as I sat there in the dark, I realized that ownership was just a technicality. The house had always been mine in every way that mattered. It lived in my bones, in my memories, in the dreams I'd been building since. I was 7 years old and learning to use a hammer. The closing took place at the law office downtown. I arrived early, partly from nervousness and partly because I wanted a few minutes to collect myself before facing my parents. The whole process felt surreal, signing document after document, transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars with the stroke of a pen, making legal and binding what had been emotional and personal. Mom and Dad arrived exactly on time, both of them dressed formally as if they were attending a funeral rather than a real estate closing. The lawyer, a woman in her 50s who'd handled dozens of these transactions, maintained professional cheerfulness despite the obvious tension in the room. "Well," she said as we signed the final documents, "congratulations on your new home, Mr. Thompson, and congratulations to you both," she nodded to my parents, "on a very successful sale." The handshake with my father felt like the most awkward moment of my life. His grip was firm, professional, but his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. Mom hugged me, and I felt her trembling slightly. "Take care of it," she whispered in my ear. "Take care of our memories." "I will," I promised, and I meant it more than any words I'd ever spoken. As we walked out of the law office, Dad cleared his throat. "The house is yours now," he said. "We'll have our personal things moved out by the weekend." "There's no rush," I said quickly. "Take whatever time you need. And if there's anything you want to keep that you think I might not understand the significance of, we'll figure it out," he said. But his tone had softened slightly. That weekend, I watched my parents pack 30 years of their lives into boxes and moving trucks. They were relocating to a retirement community about 20 minutes away, a nice place with a golf course and a community center, the kind of place where they could be active and social without worrying about home maintenance. I helped them load furniture and tried to stay out of the way while they sorted through decades of accumulated belongings. It was strange, seeing them dismantle the life they'd built in the house where I'd grown up. Strange and sad, but also somehow necessary. We all needed a fresh start. The last thing Dad packed was his toolbox from the basement workshop. As he carried it up the stairs, he paused and looked back at the space where 3 generations of our family had learned woodworking. "You know," he said without looking at me, "your grandfather would be proud of what you did, fighting for the house the way you did." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and it meant more to me than he probably realized. "I hope so," I said. "I hope he'd be proud of all of us." That night, I slept in the house alone for the first time in my life. I'd moved my belongings from the condo into my childhood bedroom, planning to eventually convert the master suite into my own space, but wanting to ease into the transition gradually, lying in the twin bed where I'd slept as a teenager, looking up at the slanted ceiling I'd stared at through countless nights of homework stress and romantic heartbreak. I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized was unsettled. This was right. This was where I belonged. Over the next few months, I began the careful process of making the house truly mine while respecting its history. I updated the kitchen with modern appliances but kept the original cabinets Dad had refinished when I was in high school. I renovated the master bathroom but preserved the vintage tile work that Mom had always loved. Every change I made was considered through the lens of honoring what had come before while creating space for what was coming next. The hardest part wasn't the physical renovation. It was navigating the emotional landscape with my parents. They were polite when I saw them at family gatherings, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before. I understood it, even if I didn't like it. I challenged their authority, questioned their judgment, and ultimately proven them wrong about my capabilities. That kind of disruption doesn't heal quickly, especially when everyone involved has been hurt. Emma visited again in the spring, and she helped me plant a vegetable garden in the backyard. As we worked in the dirt where we'd played as children, she brought up what we were both thinking about. "How are things with Mom and Dad?" she asked, not looking up from the tomato seedlings she was planting. "Better," I said, which was both true and not quite true. "We're all trying to figure out how to be a family again." Do you ever regret it? Buying the house, I mean. I looked up at the oak tree, now full of spring leaves, and at the house where the afternoon sun was hitting the kitchen. Windows just the way it had when I was 7 years old, and believed that some things would never change. Never, I said. Not for a single day. The real breakthrough came 6 months after I'd moved in. I was in the basement workshop, trying to fix a wobbly table, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Dad appeared, carrying a small toolbox.
Thought.
You might need some help, he said gruffly. That table's been wobbly since, before you were born. Takes a special technique. We worked together in comfortable silence for almost an hour, father and son united by the familiar rhythm of problem solving. With our hands? When the table was steady again, Dad sat back on his heels and looked around the workshop. Your grandfather taught me to use every tool in this room, he said. I taught you. Someday, maybe you'll teach your own kids. I hope so, I said. You did good, son, he said quietly. Buying this house, I mean. It was the right thing to do. Does that mean you think what you did was wrong? He was quiet for a long time, his hands still holding the screwdriver he'd been using. I think I was scared, he finally said. Scared. Of getting old, scared of making the wrong decisions about money and security. I thought I was being practical, but maybe I was just being a coward. You're not a coward, Dad. You were trying to take care of your family. All of my family, he said, looking at me directly for the first time in months, including you. I lost sight of that for a while. We hugged then, awkwardly but genuinely, surrounded by the tools and workbenches that had seen 4 generations. Of our family learned to build and fix and create. It wasn't a complete healing. There were still conversations we needed to have. Trust we needed to rebuild, but it was a beginning. 2 years after buying the house, I was hosting my first Thanksgiving. Dinner as the official homeowner. Emma and David had flown in from California, bringing their 6-month-old daughter, the first member of the next generation, to enter the house on Maple Street. Mom and Dad came too, along with Dad's sister and her family from Ohio. As I carved the turkey in the kitchen where Mom had prepared thousands of meals, I felt the weight and joy of carrying on family traditions. The dining room table was the same one where I'd done homework as a kid, extended now with card tables to accommodate our growing family. The conversations flowing around that table about work and politics and the baby's latest milestones were the kind of conversations that had been happening in this house for over 30 years. Uncle Jake, my 10-year-old cousin Madison said as I served her a slice of turkey. Mom says you bought this house from Grandpa Mike. Why didn't he just give it to you? The adults around the table went quiet, everyone suddenly very interested in their plates. But I looked at Madison's curious, guileless face and realized that her question deserved an honest answer. Sometimes adults make decisions that seem right at the time but turn out to be more complicated than they expected, I said. Grandpa Mike and I had to figure out a way to fix the mistake, and buying the house was our solution. But now it's yours. Forever, right? Now it's ours forever, I said, gesturing around the table. This house belongs to our whole family, even if I'm the one who gets to live in it every day. Dad caught my eye and nodded slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the guests had gone home, Emma and I sat on the front porch with cups of coffee, watching David push the baby's stroller up and down the sidewalk. She's beautiful, I said, nodding toward my niece. She is. And she's going to grow up knowing this house, knowing the stories. David and I have been talking about moving back to Michigan in a few years. His company has an office in Detroit, and we want her to be close to family. The possibility of Emma and her family living nearby, of the house once again being filled with the sounds of children playing and growing up, made my chest warm with happiness. You know, Emma continued, I never thanked you properly for what you did, for fighting for this place. If you hadn't bought it, God knows what would have happened. It might have been sold to strangers, developed into condos, lost forever. You don't need to thank me. I didn't do it just for me, I did it for all of us. For her, I nodded toward the baby, and for any other kids who might come along someday. Are you thinking about having kids yourself? It was a question I'd been considering more and more lately. At 32, I was finally feeling settled. Enough, secure enough, to think about sharing this house and this legacy with a family of my own. Maybe, I said. I've been seeing someone, actually. Sarah Chun, she's a teacher at the elementary school where Mom used to work. We've been talking about the future. Emma grinned. Sarah Chun, Mom mentioned her. She said you brought her to Sunday dinner last month and Dad actually smiled when she complimented his woodworking. She gets it, I said simply. She understands what this house means, what family means. She grew up in her grandmother's house in Chinatown, so she knows what it's like to feel rooted somewhere. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. How's the family dinner going? Save me some pie. I texted back. Always, come over whenever you're ready. Emma raised an eyebrow. She's coming over? She had dinner with her own family first, but she wanted to stop by and meet you and David properly. 20 minutes later, Sarah arrived with a bottle of wine and a shy smile. She hugged Emma like they were old friends, asked David thoughtful questions about his work in marine conservation, and cooed over the baby with genuine delight. When she offered to help clean up the remaining dishes, Mom immediately adopted her as an honorary daughter. Later, as we all sat in the living room, Sarah curled up next to me on the couch that had been in this room since I was 12. Tell me about the house renovations, she said to the room in general. Jake shows me pictures, but I want to hear the stories behind the changes. For the next hour, my family took turns explaining the intricate history of every room, every carefully planned improvement, every deliberate decision that had methodically shaped the house over the decades. Each story was layered with meaning, revealing not just the physical evolution of the space, but the emotional journey of the people who had lovingly crafted it into a home. Sarah listened with the focused attention of someone who understood instinctively that she wasn't merely hearing about home improvement projects or renovation timelines. She was being entrusted with the deeply personal story of a family, of a multi-generational legacy that might someday expand to include her own dreams and contributions. My mother shared the story of how she and Dad had painstakingly stripped and refinished every piece of original woodwork, working late into countless evenings because they couldn't afford professional restoration. Emma chimed in with memories of helping Dad install the built-in bookshelves in the living room, how he'd let her hold the level even though her small hands made the job more difficult. Dad spoke with quiet pride about upgrading the electrical system himself, learning from library books and YouTube videos because bringing in contractors would have meant months of saving when everyone finally went to bed. Their voices still echoing warmly through the hallways. Sarah and I walked through the house room by room in the gentle silence. In each space, I found myself sharing memories I'd never told anyone else, intimate moments that had shaped who I'd become. I showed her the specific corner of the kitchen where I'd hidden during my parents' only serious fight, crouched behind the breakfast table while their raised voices filled the house with unfamiliar tension. I pointed to the particular window in my old bedroom, where I used to carefully sneak out to meet friends on summer nights, the screen still bearing the tiny dent from where I'd fumbled it once in nervous haste. In the basement workshop, surrounded by Dad's carefully organized tools and the lingering scent of wood stain. I told her about the afternoon I cried there after my first heartbreak, how Dad had found me and wordlessly handed me sandpaper and a piece of rough pine. Building something with your hands, he'd said, watching me work through my tears, is the best cure for emotional pain. It reminds you that you can create something beautiful even when everything feels broken. Sarah touched each surface I described, running her fingers along the windowsill where I'd rested my elbows during countless phone conversations, tracing the slight wear pattern on the kitchen counter where 3 generations had prepared family meals. She absorbed every detail with the reverence of someone who understood she was being invited into something sacred. You know what I love most about this house? Sarah said as we ended up back in the living room, settling onto the couch where I'd spent countless hours reading, studying, and dreaming about my future. What? I asked, pulling her closer in the soft glow of the lamp that had been Grandma's favorite. It's not just that it's beautiful, although it truly is. Every room has this perfect balance of elegance and comfort that you can't fake or buy. Comes from decades of people caring about how they live. It's not just that it has good bones, although the craftsmanship is incredible. You can see Grandpa Joe's attention to detail in every joint, every carefully chosen material. It's that you can feel the love in every single room. You can literally feel the presence of all the people who've been genuinely happy here, who felt completely safe here, who've built their most important memories and dreams here. She was absolutely right, and hearing her articulate what I'd always felt but never been able to express brought tears to my eyes. The house held more than just furniture and fading photographs. It held the accumulated love, laughter, arguments, reconciliations, celebrations, and quiet everyday moments of everyone who'd ever called it home. Grandpa Joe's immense pride in building something lasting with his own skilled hands. Grandma's infectious joy in decorating their first real home, choosing every fabric and paint color with the excitement of a young woman finally able to express her own taste. My parents' nervous excitement as newlyweds setting up housekeeping, learning to blend their different backgrounds and expectations into something uniquely theirs. My and Emma's childhood wonder at having a place that was entirely, permanently, unquestionably ours, a security many of our friends had never experienced. I want to add to that, Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Someday, if you'll let me, if you'll trust me with something this precious, I want to add our love to this house. I want to raise children here who feel the same deep connection to this place that you do, who understand that home isn't just where you live, but where your heart is rooted. I pulled her closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her vanilla shampoo mixed with the comforting smell of the house I'd fought so desperately hard to keep, the combination of old wood, my mother's favorite candles, and something indefinable. That was simply the essence of generations of love and care. I want that too, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. More than anything I've ever wanted in my entire life. 6 months later, on a perfect spring afternoon, when the dogwood trees were in full bloom and the air was sweet with the promise of summer, I proposed to Sarah in the backyard, under the massive oak tree Grandpa Joe had planted as a sapling before I was even born. The tree had grown strong and tall, its branches now wide enough to shade half the yard, its roots deep enough to weather any storm. She said yes with tears streaming down her face, and we called our families from the familiar comfort of the front porch to share our joyous news. The same porch where I'd sat as a child listening to adult conversations, where Emma and I had carved our initials in the railing, where 3 generations had watched the seasons change. Dad cried openly when I told him, his voice breaking with emotion. And later that evening he admitted that seeing me find someone who loved the house as much as I did had made him realize that I'd been right all along. Not just about wanting to keep the house in the family, but about truly understanding what family meant beyond blood and legal obligations. You didn't just buy a house, he told me the night before our wedding, his hand resting on my shoulder as we stood in the backyard looking up at the stars. You bought back our family's heart. You reminded all of us what really matters when everything else falls away. Our wedding reception was held in that same backyard, under an elegant white tent stretched between the ancient oak tree and the house that had witnessed so much of our family's history. 3 generations of our combined families danced on the grass where I'd played as a carefree child, where I'd learned to ride a bike with Dad running alongside me, where I'd spent countless magical summer evenings catching fireflies in mason jars and dreaming about the mysterious future that awaited me. As Sarah and I had our first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by everyone we loved most in the place that had shaped me into the man I'd become, I thought about Grandpa Joe with overwhelming gratitude. I thought about his calloused, capable hands and his proud, satisfied smile. About his unwavering belief that building something lasting was the most important thing a person could do with their life, more valuable than money or fame or any temporary success. He built so much more than just a house with his skill and dedication. He built a foundation for love, for family, for the kind of deep security that comes not from money or possessions, but from knowing exactly where you belong in the world, from having roots that run deeper than circumstance or change. And now, it was my turn, my responsibility and privilege, to build on that solid foundation. Sarah and I were already talking excitedly about the nursery we'd create in the spare bedroom, about choosing soft colors and finding the perfect rocking chair, where we'd read bedtime stories. We dreamed about the swing set we'd install in the backyard, maybe in the same spot where my old one had been, about the family traditions we'd start and the precious memories we'd make with our own children. The house on Maple Street had survived one generation's financial mistakes and oversights, the missed mortgage payments that had accumulated like storm clouds, the tax bills that had been pushed aside in moments of desperation, the creditor calls that had echoed through its halls like unwelcome ghosts. It had weathered family conflict and uncertainty, those bitter arguments that had left scars on its walls, moments when love felt strained to its breaking point and the future seemed shrouded in an impenetrable fog of doubt and fear. The very foundations had trembled under the weight of our struggles, the floorboards creaking with the tension of unspoken resentments and half-buried grievances. It had been threatened with loss more times than I could count. Each foreclosure notice a knife to the heart, each legal document a reminder of how close we'd come to losing everything that mattered. Yet somehow it had been fought for with everything I had, with every ounce of determination I could summon from the depths of my soul, with every sacrifice I could make, every sleepless night spent poring over financial documents, every humbling conversation with bank officers and lawyers, every dollar scraped together from odd jobs and borrowed pride. Now, as the golden afternoon light filtered through the ancient oak trees that had watched over this property for decades, the house stood, ready for its next chapter. It was ready to welcome new voices that would echo through its rooms with fresh laughter and tears, new dreams that would take root in its garden and grow toward the sun, new love that would sanctify its spaces and breathe life into every corner. Where memories had been carefully preserved like precious heirlooms. The house was ready to embrace whatever the future might bring, ready to shelter another generation of hopes and fears, triumphs and failures, the beautiful, messy complexity of human existence that had always been its greatest purpose. As I looked around at our wedding guests scattered across the manicured lawn, their faces glowing with the warm light of late afternoon, I felt the weight of history and possibility pressing gently against my chest. There were my parents, dancing together on the makeshift dance floor for the first time in months, their movements tentative at first but growing more confident with each step. Their faces were transformed, glowing with the rekindled affection that had been buried beneath years of financial stress and family tension, but never truly extinguished. Dad's hand rested protectively on Mom's waist as they swayed to the music, and I could see tears of joy glistening in both their eyes, near the rose garden that Grandpa Joe had planted with his own weathered hands. Emma stood cradling her infant daughter against her chest, the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around her mother's thumb. Emma was talking excitedly with a group of cousins about their concrete plans to move back to Michigan, her voice animated with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't heard from her in years. She spoke of job opportunities, of wanting her daughter to grow up surrounded by family, of the pull she felt toward this place that had shaped us all. The baby gurgled contentedly, as if she already understood that she was coming home to something special, something enduring. And there was Sarah, absolutely radiant in her wedding dress, the ivory silk catching the dappled sunlight as she moved through the crowd of well-wishers. Her smile was luminous, transforming her entire face with a joy so pure and complete that it seemed to make the very air around her shimmer. She caught my eye across the yard and blew me a kiss, her expression filled with such love and gratitude that I felt my throat tighten with emotion, looking at all of them, at this tapestry of faces that represented everything I held dear. I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that Grandpa Joe's legacy was secure. The vision he'd carried in his heart when he'd first broken ground on this property was alive and thriving, passed down through bloodlines and sustained by the fierce devotion of those who understood its true value. The house he'd built with his own skilled hands, board by board, nail by nail, would continue to be exactly what he'd always intended it to be. A sanctuary where family could grow and thrive across generations. A foundation solid enough to support whatever dreams the future might bring, whatever challenges life might present. Its walls would continue to absorb the echoes of children's laughter, the whispered conversations of lovers, the heated discussions of family meetings, the quiet tears of those seeking comfort in its embrace, standing there in the backyard, where I'd first learned to dream, where I'd spent countless summer afternoons chasing fireflies and building elaborate forts, where I'd sat with Grandpa Joe listening to his stories of the old days, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world. I finally understood the profound, life-changing difference between inheriting something and truly earning it. I'd inherited the promise of this house, the potential it represented, the dreams it contained like seeds waiting for the right season to bloom. But I'd earned the right to call it home through sacrifice that had tested every fiber of my being, through determination that had been forged in the fires of near defeat, through hard-won understanding of what it truly meant to be a guardian of something greater than myself. The inheritance had been a gift, but the earning, that had been the real blessing. That had been what transformed a simple transfer of property into something sacred, something that connected me not just to the past but to all the generations yet to come. Who would call this place home? And that made all the difference in the world, not just for me, but for everyone who would walk through these doors, who would find shelter beneath this roof, who would discover that home was not just a place but a promise kept across time, a promise built slowly, lovingly through the quiet labor of generations carried. In the grain of the wood, in the soft creak of the floorboards, in the way the morning light always knows exactly where to fall. It was in the scent of old books and warm bread, in the laughter echoing faintly from rooms long silent, in the photograph frames slightly tilted on the wall. Untouched yet full of memory, this house had seen joy and sorrow, welcome and farewell. And yet it remained, not untouched by time, but shaped by it, made stronger, softer, more real. To some, it might look like just another old home, weathered and plain. But to those who truly saw it, it was a sanctuary. A place where love lingered, even after the people were gone, where every chipped tile and faded curtain told a story. And now, with the keys in my hand and the past behind me not erased, but embraced, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had not just come back. I had reclaimed something sacred. I had restored a legacy. And that kind of return, that kind of redemption, that kind of quiet, powerful triumph, it changes everything.